Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Let's Talk About Work on LinkedIn Live. We'll get started in just a minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining me today on this LinkedIn Live. Let's talk about work. It's been a while since I've been on LinkedIn Live, probably since 2020. So I'm so excited to be now using this platform again to talk about my favorite topic, which, if you know me, it's work. That's why the name of this is Let's Talk About Work. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about DEI. How many times have you heard those acronyms in the past several months, right? Since May of 2020, we have probably heard that acronym more times than we've heard any other acronym in the workplace. And when we think about DEI and what it stands for, right? It stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And so in May or June of 2020, many organizations decided to lean into their DEI efforts, right? To really start creating cultures of inclusion after they heard about some of the experiences that especially Black employees had been experiencing in the workplace. And then we heard from other marginalized groups as well about their experiences. So we started having conversations that we had not been traditionally invited into the workplace, which is a great thing. I was so excited about that. I was even more excited when I heard so many organizations make a commitment, right, to their DEI efforts, right, over these past almost 2 years. So I've been doing a lot of check-ins to see where are these initiatives, how are they going, right? And so therefore that's what we're going to talk about today, because from what I hear, the initiatives in many organizations have not gone as well as what they had planned them to go. So I thought about it. Ooh, DEI, maybe it doesn't always stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. It stands for dead end initiatives, because that's what I'm hearing, is that many of the initiatives have been dead end. So listen, like I said, it's been a while since I've been on this platform. If someone can just put in the chat box if you see it. I'm looking at LinkedIn on my phone. I want to make sure that you see me, you hear me. So can someone just let me know that I'm not talking to myself before I dig deep into the content? All right, I'm looking for your comments to let me know. All right, I see thumbs up. So I am assuming that you see me. I see just a black box on my screen. So I hope that you actually see me. Do you actually see me? We're here. I see that. All right, great. Do you see me? Because I don't see myself on my screen. So I want to make sure. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. I see some familiar names. I see some not so familiar names. So thank you all for taking time. I know this is kind of off of, out of work hours, especially if you're on the East Coast. So grab that a glass of wine or soda, whatever you want to. Sit back and relax. And let's talk about this. Let's talk about DEI, dead end initiatives. And as I stated, right, that what I've heard feedback over these past 18 to 24 months, that there's been such an effort on this, right? We heard so many organizational leaders come forward publicly, right, and talk about their commitment to these efforts. And to be honest, right, many of you were skeptical, they were optimistic, but very skeptical about these commitments and say, is this really going to happen? And look, I'm going to start off very positive because I have definitely heard and worked with many organizations whose efforts have absolutely been successful and they're seeing tons of progress. But in that same vein, I've heard from many organizations who've called me to say, hey, I think we need your help, or we didn't do it quite right the first time. And just people reaching out to me to say, hey, I'm just very disappointed as to where my organization's commitment has been. And so I have gathered, based on those conversations, guess based on what I've seen, some of the like 5 to 6 reasons why these DEI efforts are failing or they're becoming dead end initiatives. All right. So let's start with the first one. Now, if you're on LinkedIn, like we all are, right, you have probably seen tons of positions posted from organizations looking for a DEI lead, right? I've also seen many of those positions being filled. I'm always so excited about that. Yes, they have hired someone. That shows that first step of commitment, that they have someone in that role leading these efforts. However, one of our first mistakes that we've made when we're implementing our DEI initiatives, right, is that hiring a DEI lead isn't enough, right? And let me explain that for just a second. First of all, what I've heard is that many DEI leads, they feel like they don't have the support system that they need in order to push their initiatives forward, right? And the next thing that I've heard is that they don't have the autonomy that they need. So you've hired this lead in your organization, but you have failed to give them a budget, and you have failed to give the autonomy of how to spend that budget. Who are they going to spend it on in terms of bringing in outside help? What are they going to spend it on? What training programs, what initiatives? So here I am, I'm in this position of perceived power to do this work, and maybe I have a budget, but I've got to jump through hoops, right, in order to spend that budget. My credibility, my expertise in this field doesn't feel like it's enough because I'm not given that autonomy. And in fact, it's become a barrier. I've got to go through many hoops, so many obstacles to do what I need to do. It is essentially has stalled my D&I efforts, right? So when we think about that first mistake that organizations make when they're implementing their DEI strategy is to think, oh, we've hired a lead, right? And a lot of times that just comes off as pure performative, right? Here's an example. Perhaps you saw in the news just like this week or last week that a health system in Houston hired a DEI lead. Did you see that? And as he was moving there and getting situated, they connected him with a real estate broker. He's walking around with the real estate broker. And the real estate broker is saying, making these racially charged microaggressions. Okay. And so he reports that back to the company, his experience with that. Right. And guess what? The company actually rescinded his offer. Okay, rescinded his offer. And their reason was he was too sensitive about race issues. Oh my goodness. Can you believe that a company actually rescinded an offer for a DEI lead because they were too sensitive about um race issues. So what that tells me, right? And I'm sure that this particular person, that's not the only time that this has happened, or perhaps they absolutely were hired, right, but then they were kind of told how to do their job, what they should be focusing on, et cetera, et cetera. So when they hired that DEI lead, they had no intent on him using his expertise to create diverse and inclusive work environments. It was literally just a performative act. So when I say hiring that DEI lead isn't enough, that's exactly what I mean. I mean that you have to, if you do hire a lead, you've got to give them a budget, you've got to give them autonomy, and as some of you have said in the comments, they've got to report straight to the CEO, right? They've got to be there at that top line in order to be successful. They've got to have a team around them, and their credibility, their expertise can't be questioned, right? They've got to be able to hit the ground going. All right. So that is my first mistake that organizations make when implementing their DEI efforts. Now, here's my second one. And this one is probably the most true out of all of them. I cannot tell you how many times in the past, I don't know how many years, did I get a call, Natasha? We need, unconscious bias training. And I'm like, oh, that's great. I offer that. But let's talk a little bit more. Why do you need unconscious bias training? What have you identified in your organization? What blind spots have you identified where you believe that unconscious bias may be playing a role, right? And you not being able to have an inclusive workplace. And they're like, oh, well, we really haven't identified anything in particular. We just think we need unconscious bias training or some kind of training. Now, don't get me wrong. Organizations need training. That's what I do. That's what I love to do. However, I do not like to go to organizations and train blindly, right? In order for your training to be effective, right, this is what we must do. We first have to assess our culture, right? Do some sort of organizational culture assessment. That can be done through a survey, that can be done through focus groups. It can even be done by looking at the data in your organization and looking for blind spots, right? So, what groups are being advanced, what groups are being left behind, why is that the case, right? So looking for your blind spots, looking for your opportunities, through that organizational culture assessment, right? You've got to do that. Once you do that, then you determine what your training needs are, right? It may be that you do need some unconscious bias training, but if I'm doing the training, I want to know specifically for your organization, where does unconscious bias really show its face? How is it continuing to marginalize a certain set of employees, right? How is it affecting the decision making progress and becoming a barrier to the success in your organization? That's what I'm interested in so that my training can be the most effective. Because if I just come in and talk about, hey, this is what unconscious bias is, or this is what a microaggression is, that's great. It gets you there. People are excited. They're engaged during it. But a couple weeks later, they just don't seem to remember it, and you fall back into old habits. But if I'm able again to understand why you need this training, right? How does it connect to your overall strategy and to the blind spots of your organization? That's great. That can be, oh, people sorry. Excited. They're engaged during it. But a couple I gotta turn my own self off of LinkedIn. Sorry, this popped on. But essentially, that's what we need to do. All right, is to assess the organization first, understand where your blind spots are, and then develop your training specifically for your organization so that people remember it, right? So when they encounter those things that you've identified, that's where it kicks in, right? They're more cognizant of it, they're more intentional, and they're more purposeful in their actions. All right. So that was the second mistake that organizations tend to make when they're doing their D&I strategy. Here's my next one. All right. And this one may be a little bit controversial, but it's true. All right. Our goal, right? We should have less of a goal of creating diverse workplaces. And let me tell you why. Because we already do. Every organization has a diverse workplace because every single employee brings some dimension of diversity with them, right? Whether it's your faith, whether it's your age, right? It doesn't matter. We already bring some level of diversity. But what happens is, right? Again, we don't assess our organization to understand. And when we're talking about whether it's recruiting for diversity, right? Well, specifically, who are you recruiting for? Right? Who have you left behind? What group of employees could be providing value to your organization, but somehow your systems and structures that you have in place, right, have become barriers for them having the opportunity to contribute that value, right? So many organizations will say, hey, I'm, recruiting for Black employees. That's great. Or for women. That's wonderful. But I really challenge you to dig deeper into that and to really think about all the dimensions of diversity, right? As many of you know, I talked about my struggles with mental health and being diagnosed with a behavioral health illness, right? So that's an invisible diversity. And what I struggle with, and many others like me in the workplace, there actually needs to be an inclusive strategy to ensure we have the tools and the resources that we need to be successful. But oftentimes that's overlooked, right? Those types of things. So, again, when you're talking about diversity, right? Oftentimes, again, even going back to your training, your examples are typically around race or around gender. But you got to remember, we want to be inclusive, right? So, what are some challenges that other people are having, right? Whether it's due to their age, their socioeconomic status, their faith, their political affiliation, the list goes on and on and on when we think about that, right? So that is the third mistake that organizations make, is to only focus on a couple of dimensions of diversity, right? Or just assuming, right, that only certain dimensions of diversity are not having inclusive experiences. Right. So we're making an assumption there. So what we have to do again is to, again, assess our organization, right? We've got to assess our organization so that we can understand, right, where our opportunities are. What are those demographics of employees that don't have a sense of belonging and inclusion? Right. And it may go beyond employees of color. It may go beyond women, right? We've got to dig deeper. In fact, earlier today, I was on another panel and someone was even telling me, there was a focus on Asian Americans, but they didn't even break that down because there's differences of experience, right? And cultural background and some of those nuances, even within the Asian community. So we can't assume that everyone has the same experience, even if they're in the same demographic, right? So going back to that point number one, that's why it's so important that we assess the organization. All right. So now let's get to our next mistake that managers make when they're putting their DEI efforts. Now, we've been talking a whole lot about creating inclusive workplaces, right? And creating more diverse environments as it relates to our workforce. But sometimes in some organizations, and a lot of organizations actually, it stops there. Okay, just the workforce. What about the work that you do? Because on one hand, if you're telling me, hey, we're creating this inclusive workplace, this is our philosophy on this, we align with this views, but I am working on work that doesn't align with that, or I'm working with vendors who only come from one demographic. Right? Or we're only recruiting and pitching to clients that only come from one demographic, right? That's not quite aligned. That does not make you an inclusive workplace, right? We have to make sure that everything that our employees see, hear, touch, and do is inclusive, right? And it's aligned with our organizational values as it relates to inclusion. That, my friends, is very, very important. So I challenge you to do an audit of look at the work that you do, especially if I do a lot of work in the creative spaces, especially if you work in creative spaces, right? Let's say you get to hire models for advertising, things like that. What does that look like? And how are you challenging the perspective of your customer? If you have a huge platform, right? You have the opportunity, if you have a huge platform, such as you're an advertiser, a marketer, you're in media, you have the opportunity to create a narrative for a demographic that may have not had a positive narrative created for them, right? So use your privilege of having that big platform to create and show what inclusion looks like, to show what diversity looks like in a way that we typically have not seen it. So again, when we think about this mistake, when it comes to inclusion, it's not just about the workforce. It's about the work that we do, right? And we need to understand, just like I said before, everything that an employee sees, touches, hears, or does has to be from that place of inclusion. It just doesn't stop at the employee life cycle. All right. Now, moving on to our next mistake that organizations make when creating their DEI efforts. All right. And it is little to no leadership involvement. And this kind of goes back to my first point, right? When you just hire the DEI lead and just kind of say, go for it, but you're not giving them the tools and resources that they need for success. What I am hearing more often than probably any of these other things is that, believe it or not, these organizational leaders have made this commitment to this work, but they are the main barrier to this work getting done. Right. So, as we're coming out of the pandemic, as people are returning to normalcy, and we're starting to see, transactions happen again, the economy pick up and things returning back to normal, then guess what? There's no more time for this all of a sudden. There's no more budget for this all of a sudden. I'm too busy now. Right. So, therefore, they become the barrier. The same leader that made the commitment, right? And they're thinking, oh, I've got this D&I person that I hired. They can do it. And then guess what? They're going to turn around 6 months from now and say, well, guess what? You didn't meet your goals and you're fired because they didn't give them the resources and the commitment that they needed, right? I have circled back around with so many organizations that I've worked with, like, how is it going since we last spoke, and I've heard so many excuses and I've heard there's just no time. But guess what? If you're an organizational leader, if you're that CEO, that CFO, whatever in the C suite, whatever position of influence that you have, you single handedly have the ability to put everything on pause and intentionally and purposely make time for this work, right? You have that ability to do so if you are truly committed, right? And I shouldn't have to talk about the business case for doing so, right? We've been talking about that for years now. But if they haven't heard, now they know. something of what's called the great resignation, right? So if we don't want to be victims as an organization of the great resignation, right? That's a business case alone because people are leaving the workplace because they have now experienced what it's like not being at work. And many of them did not realize what walking through the doors of that job, how that was impacting them mentally, physically, and everything else, right? From a psychological safety. They didn't even realize it until they had the opportunity not to walk through those doors. And then all of a sudden, they're like, why do I feel so much better? Right? Why do I feel mentally better? Why do I feel physically better? I feel safe, right? Because I'm not in that culture that I was before. So if we are asking employees, and many of you are, to return to the workplace, what we can't do is to expect them to walk into the same culture that was cultivated pre COVID, pre pandemic, then post pandemic, right? We've got to make that commitment because employees are walking away. And many of them are not even walking away to new opportunities. They're just walking away and saying, I'm protecting my safety. I'm protecting my mental health, right? So this is an imperative. If you're an HR leader on the call or DEI leader, and I get this question, how do I get my CEO to listen? Then you need to give them the numbers of the millions of people that have left the workplace in the past several months. Right. And they are finding opportunities for themselves. They are enjoying themselves. They're enjoying wellness. How do we integrate that same feeling of well being in the workplace? Right. And the number one way we do that is to ensure that everyone has a sense of belonging and inclusion. And we can't do this without this work. And we can't do this without senior commitment and total involvement, right? That's your business case, right? And it's very, very imperative. Now, last but certainly not least, our final mistake that organizations make when implementing their DEI strategies, right, is not measuring the right stuff, right? When I ask, how are you measuring success of this program? I'll see these robust programs that are put into place, all of this training, mentoring, speakers, this, that. And I'm like, well, what does success look like? How do you know all of these efforts are doing good? And they'll say, well, we're measuring how much diverse candidates. By the way, I don't like that word again because everyone is a diverse candidate, but we're measuring what they say diverse candidates, how many we've hired. Look, that is a great measure, right? We do want to invite underrepresented groups, people who have not had the opportunity to work in these organizations, simply because these doors have not been open for them, not because they weren't qualified, right? We want to do that. But that's just one simple metric. We need to also measure what happens after we invite underrepresented groups into our organization, right? So as we invite them, we need to look at, right? What's the rate of promotion? So let's say I hire a female, I have a mostly male agency, I hire a female and a male at the same time. Who's getting promoted quicker and why? We've got to measure those types of things. Who is getting professional development? How many hours are spent on that? We've got to look at that type of thing, right? We've got to look at every point of the employee life cycle, even who's participating in our benefits, because that's an area of opportunity that we also don't look at, right? Your benefit offerings, are they inclusive? Are you defining through your benefits and through your policies what a family is and things like that, right? Who is taking advantage of that? Who's taking days off? Because a lot of times, if you have people and they have all of this vacation time at the end, you need to look at that. Look at that by demographic, because what that tells me, if you have a demographic and they haven't taken a lot of vacation days, that's a number one indicator that they don't feel psychologically safe to do that. All right. That's a number one indicator. So, again, that's an indicator, right? A metric that is very rarely measured by demographic, but that can tell a good story. There's also one very old data point that HR leaders love to measure, but guess what? We can't let measure it anymore. And that is time to fill. How many of you have recruiters, right? Your measure of success is how quickly can you get a body into the organization. And if your time to fill is really, really short and decreases year after year, that's considered success, right? No, 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 no. Not in a modern post pandemic culture. Because if I am taking my time to be intentional and to be purposeful about finding different types of candidate that's going to add value to my organizational's culture. And yes, I said add value and not fit into it, right? Then guess what? It shouldn't matter how long it takes. Because if my time to feel is that's my main metric, I'm going to take the easy way out. I'm going to ask somebody, hey, do you know someone for this position? They're going to say yes. And typically, that person is going to look like them. And then we create this systemic, homogeneous workplace that has not worked for us for the many, many decades that we have been doing it that way. So we got to slow down our hiring and recruitment process. Slow down the recruitment, right? Broaden that net. If you're allowing employees to work remotely, then guess what? This whole I can't find underrepresented groups to work here because of where we are and it's not very diverse and all of that. Right? Because now we have the ability with this remote work environment, which is working to broaden that net. So we need to slow down, be purposeful in our pursuit of finding people that can add value to our culture. And as we go through the interview process, we need to slow that down as well. Now, I'm not saying that you take your candidates through 20 interviews and have them take 3 weeks off work. Not saying that. What I'm saying is ensure that you're spending enough time to not just understand the backgrounds and qualifications, but to understand the inclusive behaviors, right? Recruiting and interviewing for inclusion. We've all heard of a behavioral based interviewing, but those questions need to be around how do you handle certain situations about creating inclusive environments for your colleagues and your peers, right? What does that look like for you, right? Are they your bystander interventionist? Do they feel comfortable with that, right? Those are the types of things that we need to integrate into our interview process, along, of course, with some of the obvious things that we ask, right? So, again, look at what you measure. It's more than just your hire rate, your retention rate, your promotion rate. It is also about those little subtle things along that employee life cycle. And you've got to look at it by demographic. And that demographic, going back to what I said before, has to be expansive, right? Of what we're actually looking at per demographic. All right. So those are, right, the common mistakes that I see organizations make when they're implementing their DEI efforts, right? And if you're making these mistakes, again, more likely than not, DEI in your organization stands for dead end initiatives, right? There's so much more that can be said on this topic, right? And I challenge you to start there. But there's many, many more things that are creating dead end initiatives in your organization. But as I said before, it all starts with that organizational culture assessment, right? That is key, right? Understanding your blind spots. understanding, where your opportunities are, who you really are recruiting for, and not this off the shelf check the box diversity and inclusion effort, right? We've got to be proactive, we've got to be intentional, and most importantly, this takes the effort of everyone in the organization, top down and bottom up, right? Everyone has to be committed, but especially your senior leaders, but everyone has to be committed. So, how do we do that, right? After we do our assessment, then we understand what are the behaviors, right, that are inclusive behaviors that are expected in our workplace? What are the behaviors that are not acceptable? How are we communicating that? And how are we holding one another accountable for that, right? That's where it all begins. So it has been my absolute pleasure. I'm so glad to be back on this platform on LinkedIn Live. Catch me here weekly on Wednesday nights at 6 o'clock. In the meantime, I do want to show you that speaking of training programs, I would love to come in, as you see on this last thing here, and do an organizational culture assessment for your organization. We've done it. It's true. You get tremendous value out of that. And then here are some of our new training offerings once we assess that may be beneficial to your organization. All right. So I would love to partner with you there. Otherwise, I look so forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn. Tag me, ping me. I love having these conversations. Thank you so, so much for joining. I think this will be on I saw a note asking if this is being recorded. I do think that this remains on my timeline. But otherwise, thank you again for joining. I will see you next week. Don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter. Let's Talk About Work, where I'm talking about other topics as well. So, otherwise, see you next week. Have a great week, everyone. I'll see you on LinkedIn. Bye.